Today on Straight Talk Africa, Rex Tillerson returned from his trip to Africa, only to learn he is no longer America's top diplomat. President Trump is replacing him with Mike Pompeo, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. Earlier, Tillerson met with some of America's most respected allies in Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya, Chad, and Nigeria. Security and trade issues dominated the talks. That's coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America headquarters here in Washington. I am Shaka Sali.
And hello to you, all our viewers and listeners on the continent and elsewhere. I'm Hayley Adams-Fitzpatrick, and I'll be your social media reporter today.
Today, it's a discussion and analysis on the significance of Rex Tillerson's return from his five-nation trip in Africa, only to learn that he is no longer America's top diplomat.
And coming up a little later on, our audience has weighed in on our topic through emails, Facebook, and on Twitter. We've seen those comments, and we will reveal them just ahead here on Straight Talk Africa.
Rex Tillerson is out as U.S. Secretary of State. President Donald Trump tweeted Tuesday that he has nominated CIA Director Mike Pompeo to replace him, but he still needs Senate confirmation. My colleague, Paul Cisco, has more.
Rex Tillerson is out as U.S. Secretary of State. President Donald Trump tweeted his firing Tuesday morning in the same tweet that announced his nomination of CIA Director Mike Pompeo, replacing Tillerson. Pompeo will need congressional confirmation before officially assuming the post. At the CIA, Pompeo is to be replaced by his deputy, Gina Haspel. Haspel would become the first woman CIA director. Tillerson was heading home from his first and last trip to Africa as Secretary of State when President Trump tweeted the changes. Mike Pompeo, director of the CIA, will become our new Secretary of State. He will do a fantastic job. Thank you to Rex Tillerson for his service. Gina Haspel will become the new director of the CIA, the first woman so chosen. Congratulations to all.
Right from the beginning, from day one, I've gotten along well with Mike Pompeo. And frankly, I get along well with Rex, too. And, you know, I wish Rex a lot of good things.
Tillerson's first stop was Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, home of the African Union's Chinese-built headquarters. Haile Mariam Desalegne's resignation there last month triggered the first leadership change in that nation not brought on by revolution or death. Tillerson met with African Union officials telling them China promotes dependency and undermines the sovereignty of Africa. His second Africa stop, the small Horn of Africa state of Djibouti. Camp Lemonniers has been a permanent U.S. base there since 2001. It's situated close to Somalia, Yemen, and the Indian Ocean. The base has been a crucial fulcrum for the U.S. global war on terror. He met with Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta and others in Nairobi, where he laid a wreath remembering those killed in the 1998 bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania.
Our commitment to work together as Americans and Kenyans is steadfast, it is enduring, and we will build on the shared values and our shared future, which remains very strong.
The Pentagon has supplied Kenyan Defense Forces with advanced weapons and trained Kenyan soldiers. Their hunt for al-Shabaab fighters and supporters has taken them into Somalia. Next, in Chad, Tillerson met with President Idris Deby, praising the close relations between the two countries. He then met with Nigerian officials in Abuja, the capital of Africa's most populous nation. He praised the economic powerhouse's close cooperation on matters of joint security interest. Washington has long supported the Nigerian Army's efforts to defeat Boko Haram. Paul Cisco, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that interesting report. Joining us today are two distinguished guests, Fatoumata Barry, attorney and Maryland State Delegate candidate, and Sally Buka, Executive Director, Center for International Policy. We invited the State Department officials to come on as well, but due to their scheduling conflict, they are not available. Well, I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Well, thank you, Shaka.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us.
You're most welcome. Later in the program, we'll give our audience a chance to call in with your question or comment. The number to call is 202-619-3111, and your country code is 1. Let me come to you immediately, Fatoumata. What was your immediate reaction when you heard the news yesterday that the Secretary of State, who had just gotten back really from his maiden African trip, was fired?
My first initial thought was, because I saw the tweet, so I sort of realized Pompeo is more in line with Trump. They work, I think they will probably work a lot better together. Mm-hmm. Pompeo is known for his very conservative views, and he's very, very pro-Trump. And I think that makes it much easier for Mr. Trump to have him as the Secretary of State, as opposed to Tillerson, who we have seen may diverge a little bit from Trump. And I mean, the rumors have been going on for months that he may not be there for much longer. Mm-hmm. So I think to a certain degree, people were shocked, but at the same time, not quite as shocked because it's been there for a while.
What about you, Sally?
Well, I wasn't surprised in the sense that this had been foreshadowed as early as last fall, when the president's dissatisfaction with Rex Tillerson had been communicated in a number of different ways. I think when he was appointed Secretary of State, Tillerson may have thought he would be one of the adults in the room and help the president understand the complexities of the world. He was a very successful businessman leading one of America's largest multinational corporations, ExxonMobil, and of course had more global experience than the president. But I think the president is more interested in someone who will be his mouthpiece to the world, his enforcer in a way as well. And I think he will find in Mike Pompeo someone better suited in his view to play that role. But I think it has disturbing implications for Africa.
Talking about implications, what about the manner in which he was actually fired? We're talking about via Twitter here, if true.
Yes. Well, I think it lacked dignity that one would expect any changing of senior officials at a cabinet level would at least have an audience with the president and would have an agreed upon communication strategy to the media and to the American public. So I think he was treated with disrespect. But I think this is unfortunately one of the hallmarks of the style of the current occupant in the White House.
Now, talking about style, Fatoumata, this, a lot of people will say, can only happen in Africa. In some African countries, you hear presidents firing their cabinet, members via radio or television. Mm-hmm. But in some cases, it probably doesn't matter so much because initially, sometimes, they are also, in fact, appointed either via radio or television.
Right, right. So I think that's sort of where some of us who might immigrated to this country sort of see some of the similarities. And I remember watching a show before the elections where the gentleman sort of equated Trump to maybe one of our African leaders. And by the time he was done compiling the different leaders that we've had from different countries within the continent and the similarities that he has to all these different people, you realize how similar he was to certain leaders. And I think the way he has been doing things, his style, has been very similar to some of what we may consider, and even as Americans going overseas, and some of the advice that has been given to different countries within the continent. What he's doing is sort of what this country has always spoken against. And he's sort of living and ruling the same way that we have found to not be acceptable as Americans. as it relates to other nations. So, you know, it's not very surprising. For me, the sad thing is it's becoming almost the norm, and I think that's the danger.
You know, I was looking at a letter written by Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat, New Jersey. And he was talking about how, for example, the Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was waiting for a debriefing from the Secretary of State. So what happens now?
Yes. Well, you know, Mike Pompeo still has to go through the confirmation process as Secretary of State. They don't have a report out from former Secretary Rex Tillerson to the committee, the acting Assistant Secretary for Africa, because the Trump administration is yet to name a permanent Assistant Secretary for Africa, did not accompany Rex Tillerson on the trip. So in a way, there's no one to brief the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the House Foreign Relations Committee from the senior levels of American diplomacy. And this, of course, as you pointed out, was the first trip of the Secretary of State to the African continent. Of course, the last region in the world that he visited, having visited every other region before Africa. And there is a real need for the U.S. Congress to be more engaged in discussing U.S.-Africa policy. The General Waldhauser, the head of the Africa Command, testified in the Congress this past week. And so they have the Pentagon's points of view on Africa policy. And unfortunately, that seems to be the only views that matter under the current administration, is sort of the military view of Africa, this obsession with security. And even Rex Tillerson's visit really emphasized the security aspect of U.S. interests in Africa.
Are we looking at a sort of U.S.-Africa policy trajectory change here, really? Because let's face it, I've been here for many years, I might say decades, and frankly, I do not remember a time, for example, where up to now there is nobody who has been appointed to be in the position of U.S. Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. I do not also recall a time when a Secretary of State will actually visit the continent and is not accompanied, for example, by the acting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for, for African Affairs, Donald Yamamoto.
Yes.
Is this normal practice?
It's not normal practice, and actually both the Trump administration and even the former Secretary Rex Tillerson's practice was unorthodox. In his initial travels around the world, he would use a smaller plane, he would take a smaller staff. He didn't like taking members of the media who usually accompany such a senior level trip in significant numbers. So this is unprecedented, and it doesn't augur well for the sophistication of U.S. foreign policy toward Africa. Previous administrations made sure their most senior Africa experts were on board to provide briefings. These are individuals who also have deep relationships on the continent, so that such a trip can be as meaningful as possible and not just a series of sort of set photo opportunities.
Any particular reason why there's this kind of huge change, really, as opposed to the manner in which the United States has been interacting with Africa?
Well, I think it's been the administration's emphasis on the Pentagon, on the military as the primary instrument of U.S. foreign policy. Rex Tillerson was doing the bidding of the Trump administration when he produced a budget that sought to downsize the State Department by 30%, downsize the U.S. Agency for International Development by roughly an equivalent amount, slash U.S. contributions to UN peacekeeping, which has significant implications for Africa. So it is unprecedented and it is worrisome.
You're talking about slashing also, in fact, about $1 billion from the PEPFAR fund, which was very, very, I think, very much liked on the continent because it helped, for example, combat, HIV/AIDS, and we're talking about tuberculosis and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Very interesting. Before pausing for a short break, we want to remind you that Straight Talk Africa is now streaming live on Facebook. To watch our show, just enter the keyword Straight Talk Africa and don't forget to share it with your friends. We are on Twitter and we are tweeting live. Follow us at VOA Shaka. That's VOA Shaka, and join in on today's discussion with your questions and comments. Don't forget to use the hashtag VOA US Africa, and we'll air some of your comments later in the show. We'll be right back with you, so please don't go away.
We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show. They're getting a view of the world from a different perspective, things that perhaps are not in their immediate vicinity. Today, I could put in on the show something that is a little different, a little unique, and this gives me that inspiration to come to work.
This is Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. What is your opinion about today's topic? Call us at 202-619-3111. U.S. country code 1. When you call, remember the following. Ask only one question. Keep your comment brief and turn down the volume on your radio or television. Now let's return to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much. Esther gives you your word. And of course, this is Straight Talk Africa, coming to you live from Washington. Let me come to you, Fatimata, again. Who exactly is the new kid on the block? You know, pending, of course, Senate confirmation. Who is Mike Pompeo? We know that he was on top, of course, of his class at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
Yes.
He got a law degree from Harvard. He was also a member of Congress from Kansas. What else do we know about him?
Well, what we know is what he has always shown. He's very conservative. He's very conservative-minded. He was one of the most vocal proponents of Trump during the election. And as CIA director, I think he had a difficulty focusing on being the director and focus more on being sort of the person who communicates where Trump stands on certain issues. And I think maybe that is the reason why he's been appointed to this position. He's a conservative, and he has always promoted very conservative views, and I think that could be a detriment to the continent and the views that he has of, Trump has the America First, make America great again, and his definition of America First is basically cut aid to USAID, cut services that could benefit anyone else out besides who he thinks should benefit. And I think Mike Pompeo will promote that and would push that. And he's very much hawkish. He's very hawkish. So because he is hawkish, one of the concerns I had is that what he's going to take overseas as Secretary of State? Is that what we're going to have where we're not, the Secretary of State is supposed to be more diplomatic? Are we now going to have someone who will sort of put the diplomacy aside and focus more on the fighting and the grandstanding? So that's who Mike Pompeo is, and some of the concerns that I have if he's confirmed.
Is that the way that you could probably promote American values, interests, and investments?
Well, Mike Pompeo is a bit of an ideologue. He was a Tea Party activist with not a lot of political experience before he came to Congress. He's from Wichita, Kansas, the home of Koch Industries, the multi-billionaire brothers Koch family with very, very conservative views, libertarian views. They want to deconstruct the government and emphasize private sector and private profit. And he has been very much an envoy for Koch Industries in his career in Congress. He's also been very xenophobic, very racist, very anti-Muslim in many of his public comments. He's a deeply religious person, but very much toward the Christian fundamentalist end of the spectrum. So that raises concerns about how he will promote an American role in the world that seeks international cooperation, that seeks to resolve conflicts among different faiths, different countries. He was also vehemently opposed to the nuclear agreement with Iran. And of course, now we're looking at a situation where the president is going to be negotiating with the president of North Korea, on denuclearization. It is a cause for concern. He was also very much a defender of torture, which he referred to as enhanced interrogation measures during his tenure in Congress and during his tenure at the CIA as well. So for human rights activists in Africa who are concerned about the use of torture by their own governments, it should be very worrisome that the man who's becoming Secretary of State is someone who has publicly expressed his belief in the use of those kinds of internationally outlawed measures.
I see. I was looking at some of the world reactions, actually, to the firing of, Secretary Tillerson. And from Japan, Tokyo says, it bids actually farewell to, quote, trustworthy, quote, Tillerson. And as far as Seoul is concerned, South Korea, it is awaiting for, quote, seasoned, unquote, Pompeo. What do you read into that, Fatmata?
It's hard to say, mainly because I think Tillerson showed the image of someone who you can speak to, you can talk to, and can make sense, and someone who is intelligent, and as you said earlier, they're grown up in the room. And maybe that's what the first quote, what'd you say he said again?
The first quote was that, Tokyo bids farewell to trustworthy Tillerson.
Exactly. So his image is very different from what we have gotten from this administration to this point. And I think that doesn't bode well for our image as the U.S. It doesn't bode well for the international view of us and whoever they end up confirming to take his place. Because if they feel that he's more trustworthy, and I'm not sure what we're going to have in Pompeo.
What about the fact that Pompeo comes from, remarkable military background, and as obviously a graduate of the West Point, you would probably expect him to be, quote, an officer and a gentleman.
An officer, yes. However, if the things he has said in the past and promoted in the past, anything to go by, the role as a Secretary of State equals diplomacy.
Correct.
And his past and his history does not equal diplomacy. The things he has said, the organizations he has been a member of, the things he has promoted have equal hate. They have equal exclusion as excluding other groups, especially groups that are quote unquote other. And I'm not sure how that would translate to diplomacy as a Secretary of State. Yes, military, but this is not a military job. This is a diplomatic position where you have to sell the positive image of the U.S. at the same time as you broker deals with other nations to ensure that the U.S. benefits from whatever it is you're trying to do. But if your focus is military, that takes away from negotiating and brokering deals.
But what about the fact that the president actually says that he and Pompeo happens to be on the same page?
Exactly.
Doesn't the president need someone that he feels very comfortable with in order to do his job? And
that's the problem. This is someone who went back and forth about having a bigger button to, to send nuclear weapons. So if they're of the same mind, that does not exactly translate to the job of a Secretary of State. And that exactly is the problem, the fact that they are of the same mind.
Sally, what about some very strong, points as far as Pompeo is concerned? Surely there must be some good things associated with him.
Well, as you pointed out, he's certainly highly qualified in terms of his educational background, Harvard, West Point. He's certainly someone very knowledgeable, but his ideology is one that very much runs at odds with the American Constitution and rule of law if he's someone willing to countenance torture, something that is illegal internationally, and since the Obama administration, it has also been made illegal again in the United States. Those are concerns. But the Secretary of State is supposed to be the country's leading diplomat and speak with the power of the president.
Right.
Rex Tillerson was often criticized as not really having the authority to speak on behalf of the president because of the differences he had with President Trump. He was also not popular at the State Department among the Foreign Service career officers because he was slashing the department, the number of staff positions. There was an exodus of senior, seasoned diplomats from all of the different divisions of the State Department. So there are some that believe that Pompeo can restore order to the State Department, raise its profile again, and gain it the support of the White House. That remains to be seen. The budget that's been presented to Congress still seeks to eliminate significant funding and positions of the State Department, still seeks to eliminate a lot of diplomacy and development initiatives. At the same time, it seeks to continue this incredible increase in military spending on the Pentagon.
What about the U.S. allies? And I'm specifically here talking about the United Kingdom.
Yes. Well, this is another curious thing that as soon as Rex Tillerson got off the plane from Africa, he also issued a statement condemning Russia for the recent chemical attack in the United Kingdom that the British government has accused the Russian authorities of being responsible for. And moments later, he was fired in a tweet. Now, this is another curious feature about Mike Pompeo. At the CIA, which is also, of course, obviously trying to gather intelligence and investigate what did the Russians do to interfere with the U.S. elections in 2016. Mike Pompeo took control of that investigation in the CIA so that he would be responsible for moderating however they pursued that investigation and how they communicated that. He's very much the defender of the president. So on the one hand, that gives him the authority to speak on behalf of the president. On the other hand, it doesn't suggest that he will be a shining light in the history of American diplomacy.
Now, for the matter, how does President Trump navigate his relationship with Theresa May, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Britain being really one of the most probably close, or if not the closest ally of Washington, and the President's relationship with Mr. Putin, the President of Russia?
If it was any other president, if it was anyone else in the White House, I would say that your first allegiance is to the UK. That's our ally. That's who we should align ourselves with. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that this administration has the capability of doing what we should as Americans. He doesn't have it. He hasn't spoken about what was determined in the UK. He hasn't issued the sanctions against Russia. He hasn't taken any steps against Russia during his time in office. So I'm not sure that he even thinks about the navigating of his relationship with Theresa May and how he deals with Putin, because for all intents and purposes, Putin is a strong man and he likes strong men. And as a result, Putin is who he looks at as the right type of leader. And so I don't believe he's going to do anything that would make America be what America has always been as far as relationship with the UK is concerned.
Well, Fatimata, unfortunately, time is not our best ally. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment, including our social media segment. So please don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
Like Voice of America on Facebook. Follow VOA on Twitter. Join VOA on our YouTube channel. Like, follow, join VOA.
This is Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. Call us now with your questions and comments. The number is 202-619-3111 and the U.S. country code is 1. Call us direct and we'll call you right back. Remember to turn down the volume on your radio or television and keep your comments brief. Now back to Straight Talk Africa.
Welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. It's time to bring in our social media reporter, Heidi Adams Fitzpatrick. Take it away, Heidi.
Thank you very much, Shaka. We've received really good feedback this week. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had just wrapped up a 5-nation tour of Africa, reaffirming America's commitment to the continent when he was sacked. His dismissal came 2 months after President Trump's reported derogatory comments about several African nations. This was Tillerson's first and last trip to Africa as America's top diplomat. And so that leads us to our question of the week, in which we asked, of course, prior to Tillerson's firing, how much impact will U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's 5-nation visit to Africa have? Let's kick things off here with a tweet from John Mondo. To some extent, the USA can manage to be closer to Africa in terms of social, economic and military cooperation, but it will need a dogfight with China, which is highly influential on the continent. And we have another tweet from Philip Onan, and he says, unless they are willing to table something more substantial than China, unfortunately, all they confront is their security interests, but less so their economic interests. The U.S. is like a parent gradually realizing their child is becoming less dependent on them and looking to another. The East doesn't bully. Our last tweet is from Mohammed Awal. Here's what he says. Unfortunately, not much, considering all the mixed signals coming from the White House about Africa. Now to our social media comment of the week from Facebook fan Obasoge Osamudia Men from Benin, and he writes, the visit, if successful, will help endear the U.S. to Africa again and dispel the perceived resentment for the U.S. recently engendered by the U.S. president's alleged use of expletives in describing some countries in Africa. So, Shaka, the visit is definitely an auspicious one that will help the U.S. resuscitate what appears to be a very strained relationship with Africa. Let's go now to another comment from Facebook fan Uguba from Nigeria, who writes, it will enhance international relations among U.S. and African states. Another Facebook comment comes from Ken Fifi in Uganda, and he says he, Tillerson of course, has impact in Kenya by sealing a deal between Kenyatta and Odinga. I wish he had passed via Uganda. And our last Facebook comment comes from Vincent Atuma from Nigeria, who writes, do such diplomatic visits usually have any impacts? In my view, they usually come with empty assurances. And so a reminder that we appreciate all of your audience feedback. If you are a new fan, do drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. And to comment on our Facebook page, just enter these keywords on your screen, Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com. And if you want to join our YouTube channel, you can sign up to VOA TV2 Africa. Of course, you can also follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka. Straight Talk Africa streams live every Wednesday on Facebook. You can simply go to VOA's Straight Talk Africa TV program page that is on our website. And to watch us live on your mobile device, download the VOA mobile app. Now, let's take a look at what is ahead for next week. On the next Straight Talk Africa, Rex Tillerson's first official visit to Africa was also his last. He was ousted as U.S. Secretary of State just hours after returning to Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump has tapped CIA Chief Mike Pompeo to replace Tillerson as America's top diplomat. Tillerson's trip to Africa focused largely on China's growing influence on the continent. An in-depth discussion on what his abrupt exit means for U.S.-Africa policy on the next Straight Talk Africa. And that's where we will leave it for our social media segment today. Shaka, plenty of social media comments to discuss there, so I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thanks, Heidi, for sharing some social media reaction with us. And of course, today we are talking about the significance of Rex Tillerson's 5-nation Africa tour and his subsequent firing. Our guests today are Fatimata Barry, attorney and Maryland State Delegate candidate, and Sari Buka, Executive Director of Center for International Policy. I have to say once again that I am profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you,
Shaka.
You're most welcome. You, of course, heard what Heidi has to say in terms of reaction from the various social media. What is your reaction to that, Fatimata, so far? And in fact, what is your really assessment of this Tillerson visit?
Because this administration has not really put forth, in my opinion, a real agenda for the continent, a real proactive or positive agenda for the continent. His visit, to me, did not really seem to have any significance as far as impacting the continent. I think a lot of it focused more on protecting the U.S. interests as it relates to China and trying to ensure that China does not wedge in where there has been an opening, especially since this administration came in and they say everything is only about America. And also to ensure that somewhere like Djibouti continues to be the place where they can continue to work on security and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure.
But what about the fact that the Chinese are present right now in Djibouti?
Yes, exactly.
Just like the Americans and the French, they have bases there.
Exactly. So that's why I think the visit itself was a way for this administration to try to stave off the Chinese and others going in and taking over where the U.S. may lag, because this administration has spoken so much about not being concerned about other countries, forgetting the fact that these other countries also support the U.S. and the security of the U.S. The security of the U.S. is necessary, is there because these other nations are necessary partners. And if you continuously talk about not caring about these other countries and making derogatory comments about them, then it sort of leaves an opening for someone else to go in who doesn't do that.
Sari, if you're one of these key African leaders that Mr. Tillerson interacted with on his 5-nation trip, what do you feel? What do you think? Do you take him seriously? Do you take your interaction with him seriously? What do you think about the United States, really?
Well, if we look at his interaction just with the African Union Commission Chairperson Moussa Faki Mohammed,
right.
In April of 2017, Secretary Tillerson, who had just recently been confirmed as Secretary of State, invited him to come to Washington and then stood him up and snubbed him. This was a major international snub and sort of expressing that the U.S. does not consider take Africa seriously, is treating its most senior official representing the continental body so negatively. And then you had the president's essentially openly racist remarks about the African continent preceding Tillerson's visit to Africa. He meets with Chairperson Moussa Faki once again, and they agree to say, well, we're putting these comments behind us. They don't address the issue. One of my concerns is, what are the African leaders bringing to these conversations? Where's their Africa First agenda to meet the America First agenda so that the talks have some real gravitas and some meaning? It is important, I think, for America's top diplomats always to be traveling to Africa. The President of the United States should also travel to Africa several times, in my view, during their term in office, though I don't imagine the current president is really looking forward to such a trip. So diplomacy must be taken very seriously. And I think Africans are looking for a more serious engagement, but they do have to do their own homework in terms of what interests are they putting forward and what do they want from the United States. Now, my own travels and work in Africa suggest to me that if the U.S. is not engaged, Africans quickly move on and say, fine, the Chinese are engaged. They're building infrastructure. They're offering loans. They're helping increase the economic growth rate in a number of countries, which helps create jobs, which helps address this incredibly increasing population rate and urbanization rate. The future of the world, I always like to say, is African. Within the next 30 years, 1 out of every 4 humans on the planet will be from Africa. And 1/3 of every human on the planet will be African by the turn of the next century. So I think the United States needs to recognize that and needs to not have such a small view that it's only concerned of threats coming out of Africa, whether that's Ebola or some exaggerated sense about terrorism, and really look at Africa and all of its diversity and all its riches, beginning with its people, and stop trying to deport Africans from this country, but invite more of them here to help strengthen our own standing in the world.
I think you have a point. Some will say, Sally, that the future of this globe, really, as we look at it, is Africa. But that is if Africa, first and foremost, probably solves the leadership deficit problem.
Yes.
What about the fact that African leaders now, perhaps more than ever before, they have alternatives? Doesn't Washington look at this? I mean, why does it, in fact, underestimate Africans? Because African leaders can now look to Beijing. They can deal with Turkey. They can deal with any of these other emerging nations.
Sure. So many of the middle powers like India, Brazil, Turkey, as you mentioned, are
the BRICS.
Exactly, the BRICS. They're very engaged in Africa. It's changing economic relations, political relations, alliances, and global forums, whether discussing trade or climate change or global immigration issues. So the United States ignores Africa at its own loss. So Africans do have alternatives in terms of their international relations. They also, unfortunately, as you were pointing out earlier, we have a model in the U.S. now of authoritarian leadership. And that only encourages the worst traits in Africa of authoritarian leadership. Individuals who want to change the Constitution so they can stay longer in power. Individuals who dismiss their senior officials with a tweet or a radio announcement, as our president has as well. So the U.S. is both providing a bad example of its own sort of leadership style, and it's also ignoring very real American interests in Africa. Fortunately, there are so many Americans who are interested in Africa across, you know, the American public, whether it's people of African descent, whether it's recent African immigrants, whether it's Latinos, Asian Americans, white Americans, whether it's education, trade, business, culture. There's a real great interest in Africa and an increasing engagement with Africa from among civil society. You have Facebook, you have social media, you have the ability to understand and develop relations on the continent even without traveling, although I would encourage people to travel more to Africa. So I am hopeful, because I'm hopeful about the body politic and the American population.
One might also add perhaps that Americans are also lucky because, let's face it, America is run by strong institutions, not by strong men.
Well, that's absolutely true, and that's the good lesson. Hopefully Africans will invest more in building strong institutions, and not just national institutions, but regional institutions and Pan-African institutions.
Unfortunately, Sally, time is not our best ally. You're tuned into Straight Talk Africa. To participate in our conversation, please call us at 202-619-3111. US country code is 1. We'll continue our discussion in a moment, so please don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
Just the next generation of African leaders, they are today's leaders. And this is the time to invest in them. Today, not tomorrow. So let's connect. Let's engage with each other on issues that will transform our societies. Innovation, leadership, entrepreneurship, things that you're doing to move the continent forward, to make you the greatest generation that Africa has known. It's Up Front every Wednesday, 17:30 UTC, right here on the Voice of America.
If you like today's show, please write and tell us what you think or give us some suggestions. Be sure to tell us what station you're tuned into. Our address, Straight Talk Africa, Voice of America, 330 Independence Avenue Southwest, Washington, D.C. 20237 USA. Or send us an email at africatv@voanews.com. Log on to our website at voaafrica.com. Or post your comments on Facebook. Keywords Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizu-Yuwat. And of course, this is Straight Talk Africa, coming to you live from Washington. Let me come to you again, Fatimata. What would be your advice to African leaders, really, to get their thing, you know, to figure out a way of making sure that they protect their people, provide service delivery, education, and the sort of things, frankly, that are still lacking there? Because let's face it, ever since I was born, and I'm sure I'm much older than you, I was always being told or heard that Africa produces what it does not consume, and consumes what it does not produce. And it seems to me, frankly, that that pattern has not yet been broken. I mean, now you hear about China, but some will probably tell you that, frankly, this is like another colonization by the Chinese. Because what are they looking for in Africa? Basically, natural resources. Africa is not a poor continent. It's just about probably leadership deficit that makes people poor.
Yes.
So what's the solution?
African leaders need to put their people first. They need to think about their people first. They need to be able to look at their country and think, if this was my child, what would I want for my child? And I think that's missing with African leaders. We have leaders whose focus is more on having an office and having control and having power, and not so much on serving the nation that they are there to serve. Our continent has a lot of resources. Even within my own native country, Sierra Leone, 6 million people. That's it. About 6 to 6.5 million people.
I hear you're now about 7. About 7 million people?
7 million people.
You have the diamonds in
and
the
we
corner.
have diamonds, we have rutile, we have iron ore, you name it, we have it. And yet, and we're coastal, but we import rice. What is that? And things.
I hope you don't import fish.
That would be very sad. So, you know, people come into these countries and they take, but we allow them to take. So we may be upset and angry and disappointed of foreigners who come in, but our nation are the ones who allow it. And I think our presidents need to think more about the people they're there to lead than themselves, and think more about the people than their party, because we have a major issue back in the continent because we are so split by party and color and so on, as opposed to what agenda we need to have for each country. And I think that's what they need to do, and focus less on the outside and focus more on what we are doing inside.
I see. Let's go to the lifeline of the show, which are the telephone callers. Good evening, Abubakar from Ghana. You're most welcome to Straight Talk Africa.
Hello, good evening, Shaka.
How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Shaka. This is Abubakar Jallo, also known as Tafa from Accra, Ghana.
My pleasure to interact with you. What is your question?
My question to one of our guests, I've heard him say that African leaders must also bring maybe their proposals towards the U.S. government. And my question to him is that based on the majority leaders we have in Africa here, most of them, I can say, they are not legitimately elected as a leader. And now China has given them free passage. They go to China and get whatever they want without any conditioning attached to it. Do you think they will leave China and come to the United States where there will be so many conditionality attached to whatever they need in the United States? I don't think it will be possible. Thank you very much, Shaka. God bless you.
You're most welcome. What about that point? Sally, African leaders, he says, a lot of times they are not really elected, so to speak. In fact, I'm one of those people who say most of them are selected. Perhaps the correct word should be African rulers, really, because they don't feel need for being accountable to the people because the people don't actually elect them anyway.
Well, I would push back a little, and I would say democracy is a work in progress. It's never finished. It's something that evolves. I would say there's more democracy in Africa today than 10 years ago. There are 18 countries having elections in this current year. There is a movement toward greater participation in political lives of countries. If you take Ethiopia right now, an authoritarian government, but that is, you know, the prime minister has resigned and they're now having to face the question of needing to democratize,
But don't forget that the Obama administration characterized Ethiopian democracy as 100%. This despite the fact that you do not even have a single
opposition person
in parliament.
Yes,
the two chambers, actually.
Yes, but what I'm suggesting is you see the protests that have been happening in Ethiopia, which forced the resignation of the prime minister.
Correct.
You see the state of emergency they've put in place. So yes, there is a repressive response, but the ruling party has also recognized that they have to give greater participation, not just to the Oromo. There are some 84 different ethnicities and languages in Ethiopia. It is a very diverse and potentially a very powerful country. And I think the leadership there, along with civil society, has an opportunity to find a nonviolent path to a more democratic system of governance. They've been the fastest growing economy on the African continent in recent years, in part because of Chinese investment. They've not just been engaged in extractive industries, but also adding value and producing and trying to industrialize. So, you know, it's not all negative. No. And even the struggles of human rights activists and democracy activists in Africa have to be acknowledged, and they are reaping dividends. Look at the case of the elections in Kenya. Initially, the Supreme Court in Kenya threw out those elections. That would never have happened before. Now, of course, they reran the elections, and there are more troubles, but the two leaders have reached some kind of reconciliation to avoid violence and to try and continue continue focusing Kenya on growth as a single nation, allowing people to have political participation. Look at South Africa with the deposing of Jacob
perfect.
Zuma.
That's a real democracy.
It's
South Africa.
a work in progress.
No question about it. You could talk about Mauritius, definitely.
Yes.
Could talk about
Senegal,
Botswana,
Ghana.
Senegal. You could talk about Benin. You could talk about, in fact, Liberia most recently.
Yes, exactly.
You could even talk about the Gambia.
Or Sierra Leone.
Or Sierra Leone, for that matter, seems to be, of course, on the right track. But let's face it, you're talking about Ethiopia. More than 105 million human beings. Yes. And it is controlled by a community. The Tigrinya, they form about 6%. Look at Nigeria. Maybe something is happening there. So we should be optimistic.
Yes.
Well, we should be optimistic, but we should work for the change because countries can go backwards as well. Sometimes I worry about my own country, and is it going backwards in terms of the right to exercise your right to vote, freedom of speech, other things like that, without surveillance, etc. So citizens across the world must always be vigilant, protect their rights, insist on the rule of law, insist on the accountability of governments. Africans are doing the same thing. So I have faith in the African people to continue the struggle to improve their governments, improve their systems. I just think the U.S. government, being the wealthiest country in the world, could offer more support and assistance in African efforts to achieve that, beginning with setting a better example ourselves.
But what do the average African really, what does the average African do, especially in situations where increasingly African rulers are essentially amending constitutions so as to become life presidents? What do you do? I mean, when you think about democracy, really, the democratization process on the continent, you probably have to look at West Africa, really, and a bit of Southern Africa. But the rest, we talk about Central Africa, beginning with Equatorial Guinea, where you have Theodore Obiang, who has been in power for 38 years. And the man who killed his own uncle, that his uncle was a dictator. And then you have Paul Biya in the neighborhood, same neighborhood. I mean, then you go to Sassou Nguesso in Congo, Brazzaville.
This is true.
You have
these are the
Gabon.
dinosaurs, and time will certainly take its toll if the people don't remove them first. Well, you look at Burkina Faso, where the previous head of state, Compaoré, tried to extend his own stay and change the constitution. The people ran him out of office. So there are these trends, I think, in Africa that favor greater democracy. But the question is, will it happen fast enough? Because as I mentioned, there's this incredible demographic bulge that's about to occur as population growth increases, and you're talking about a young population. Will they have the jobs? Will they have the political voice that they need?
Fatimata, you have the last word, 30 seconds.
Well, I think the continent is moving forward, and I think the young population is the population that will be able to save us and save the continent. And I think educating them, not just from there, but from over on this side of the ocean, will help the continent. Because as we all know, if the youth are standing up, change will happen. The old guard cannot be around forever. And if the youth feel stronger and they feel supported and they feel that their voice will matter and their voice will count, then they'll be louder. And if they're louder, we can make change. And
that could happen especially because they benefit from the social media, unlike us.
Yes.
Basically, who were beneficiaries of the printing press. You remember?
That's right. And before that, the drums.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, on that note, our distinguished guests are Fatimata Bari and Sally Buka. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning is Daybreak Africa with James Bate. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning in to Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter Africa. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.